If you work in quality control at a candy factory, you know strict safety regulations come with the job. It's why you partner with Grainger. Grainger helps you find the high-quality and compliant products your business needs to inspect, detect, and help correct issues. And the sweetest part is, everyone gets a product that's as safe to eat as it is delicious. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the
it.
writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing isn't
So some
there,
readers love that, and some readers are like, "But I wanted more of this." So it's kind of it's kind of a gamble.
Hello and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. Joining me today is a critically acclaimed best-selling author of speculative fiction, sci-fi and horror. It is Nicholas Binge. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome.
Yeah, lovely to be here.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Kicking things off, by the time this episode goes live, it's not out right now, but when this goes live, your third novel, Dissolution, will be out around the world. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so the quick pitch really is that our main character, Maggie Webb, who is this 83-year-old woman, has lived the last decade or so caring for her elderly husband, Stanley. And memory loss is gradually erasing, all the beautiful moments they created together. She feels like she's losing him. She feels like she's losing the sense of the life they had together. It's her dealing with his dementia and caring for him is really the loneliest she's ever felt in her life. And it's quite a sad opening in that sense. But quite quickly, a mysterious stranger who calls himself Hassan appears at her door and suggests a surprising secret, which is that Stanley isn't actually losing his memories. Someone is actively removing them to hide a long buried secret from coming to light. And if Maggie does what she's told, she might be able to reverse it. She might be able to get her husband back. And so she's kind of whisked away by this character. And what she's encouraged to do using these kind of technological marvels that Hassan seems to have access to is to dive into her husband's mind and into his memories, which are kind of slowly disappearing, in order to find whatever it is that has been hidden and that people are trying to hide. And the plot just kind of spins out from there. I'm not going to say any more because there are twists and spoilers and not everything is as it seems at the beginning, and not everything that everybody's saying is necessarily what it appears to be.
Okay, very cool. You're getting sort of Inception vibes. You're kind of teetering the line between this is, in theory, scientific, speculative fiction, but also that, anything can happen in one's imagination. So if we're in someone's mind, anything can happen. Yeah,
and that gives me quite a wide framework to play with kind of weird fiction and horror and things like that in a way that I really enjoy doing. I mean, it's ostensibly sci-fi in its concept, but much like my previous books and anything I write, really, it's very what you might call genre blending. So it's sci-fi, it's horror, it's got fantastical elements, it's ideally written with some of the beats of a thriller, like it's quite pacey. It's designed to be quite exciting and twisty, and I like just kind of bringing all of those together in a recognizable space. I mean, one of my favorite things to do in novels is start in a recognizable space, in a space that the reader can go, I can associate with that. I can empathize with that. Whether that is the experience of caring for a loved one, whether that's whatever it might happen to be. And then just slowly twisting that and changing that and forcing the reader to question every assumption that they had at the beginning of the book as things get weirder and weirder and weirder. It's a huge amount of fun to write and hopefully a huge amount of fun to read. Interestingly, you mentioned Inception, and many people do. The minute that I say, diving into somebody else's mind, but I didn't think of Inception once when I was writing the book. For some reason, it just didn't occur to me. I was thinking of lots of other comp titles, and as soon as I'd finished it and I sent it to think I said to my agent, and he was talking about it, and he was like, "Oh, like Inception." And I was like, "Oh my god, it is just like Inception, isn't it?" I had not clocked that. Obviously, it is quite different ultimately, but yeah, it's a funny one.
Yeah, it's like reverse Inception, because they're trying to put an idea in where she's trying to get an idea out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Inception is dreams, whereas this is memories, and or certainly that's what it appears to be. And I think part of it was that I was actually writing another book around the time as we were kind of selling this and getting it ready for publication, which will come out in a year's time. The next book, which actually deals head on with the idea of going into people's dreams as opposed to going into people's memories. And so in my head, that book was my kind of Inception comp book and not this one. But I can definitely see, I mean, even with Ascension before, when people ask me what kind of genre I write, I usually go in one of two directions to explain it to people. Either people who don't necessarily read a whole load of books that I can give comp titles to, or just kind of friends and family. And the first one is either, the messed up, slightly horrifying episodes of Doctor Who. That's the genre I write in, or a Christopher Nolan film. Both of those two that's the kind of space that I'm in.
Okay, there's a massive difference in budget between those two things.
Yeah, but not in a book. That's the beautiful thing. I can do anything in a book, and I don't have to worry about budget, which is beautiful.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I wanted to ask about, and I feel like I could maybe guess, but I wanted to ask about your writing process, because the stories you tend to focus on, there's usually a sort of an intricate concept at their core. So when you're thinking of like a new idea, of a new story, is that the starting point? Do you think of the interesting kind of concept first and then build everything around that?
I think so, yeah. It's hard to say where exactly the inspiration derives from initially. I tend to think of it like I've always got 10 to 15 different things bubbling around in my head, whether that's an idea for a character, whether that's an idea for a concept, whether that's an idea for a setting. I'll have read something, or I'll have kind of, in a newspaper, or I'll have noted something or thought about something, and I've gone, oh, that's a cool idea for a book. And I've kind of filed it away at the back of my head, like a pot simmering on the back hob that I'll come back to later. And then when novels come about, it's usually a process of, there's enough things there that I'm usually going on a walk somewhere or doing something where my brain is free to wander. And 2 or 3 of those elements will just kind of come together at the same time. And I'll see the links between them, and I'll go, oh, that's a novel, that is. That's that concept, that character, that thing, that plot twist, whatever it happens to be that I've been thinking about, they'll suddenly conflate into a single thing. And I'll know what I want to write. But as far as the writing process goes, often it'll be a starting point and I won't really know where I'm going. Increasingly now, I'm very much a discovery writer. So I'll start with this, like with a character and a concept, and I'll just start writing. And I really, really won't necessarily know where I'm going to take it. I kind of have to trust my brain and trust my subconscious that I'm eventually going to get somewhere sensible. What I know I can do is I can continue to kind of keep escalating. I can continue to kind of try and make things a bit weird and turn things on their head and question the assumptions of what's going on. But I don't have a clear end in mind when I start books, and I don't necessarily know where they're going to end up. That's
so interesting. I feel like I'm forever flummoxed in my assumptions about which genres are written in which ways, because I haven't had too many sci-fi sort of speculative fiction writers on. I've had a few. I've had a lot of psychological thriller authors on. And in my head, because most psychological thrillers revolve around a central twist, which kind of informs the ending, I'd always assumed these must be planned and plotted out. But so many of them are discovery writers like yourself. And I would have assumed with the kind of things that you're writing that they would have been meticulously planned out and you would know exactly what was going to happen step to step. So I'm surprised to find out that you're mostly a discovery writer.
Yeah, and it certainly, you can make it seem like that afterwards. And there is a lot of meticulous planning that needs to go into it post hoc, I think, when you go back and kind of make all the pieces work. Because I like to do a lot of playing with structure and structural elements and having them come together in interesting ways. But what I do a lot of, which I think I've explained to other writers sometimes, and some get it and some really don't get it at all, which just shows how writing process is so different for different people. But I do a lot of what I call laying breadcrumbs for my subconscious to play with. So I'll put down things at the beginning of a book where I don't necessarily know what they're there for or why, but something in my head will go, this feels right, this seems cool, this seems like something I want to play with, and I often won't work out what I'm going to do with them until 30,000, 40,000 words later or more. So for example, Dissolution opens with a countdown. It's sort of one of the first things that you read on the page is 11 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds to dissolution. And this, at the beginning of each alternating chapter, the countdown kind of starts to count down closer and closer to 0. When I first wrote that, when I tapped that down on the page, and indeed for the next few chapters as I was writing it, I had absolutely no idea what I was counting down to. I didn't know what dissolution was. I didn't know why it was there. But by the end of the book, I'd worked it out, and it just all kind of came together in my head and actually provided the ending that I think worked really well.
Oh, that's a really cool way of writing. I mean, obviously, like you say, some people get it, some people it won't work for everyone. But I understand from my own experience and from speaking to some people that a lot of the time writers will go back and add foreshadowing, or they'll later on in the book you're writing something and you think, oh, this is perfect, I can tie this back to this thing that happened at the beginning, even though originally I hadn't planned that. So you just kind of laying out things where you're like, at some point I might have a light bulb moment and think, I can tie this back to that, and it's going to really like tie this whole thing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it doesn't. And the beauty of it is you can just take it out. I think of it a little bit like the J.J. Abrams approach to storytelling in the first season of Lost, where he just kind of, it would feel a little bit like all sorts of just ideas would be thrown in, as if he just walked into the writer's room one day and gone like, let's put a polar bear on the island, because that's cool and that's mysterious. But the difference is that they obviously have to air the seasons as they write and film them, so they can't go back when something's not relevant anymore and take it out. Whereas when I get to the end of the book, I can streamline things and I can work out actually what mysterious elements ended up paying off for me and what didn't. But what I'm giving myself is I'm giving myself a toolkit, I suppose. I'm giving myself things to play with down the line. Yeah.
How many of these things do you kind of think you roughly get rid of versus keep by the time you've kind of finished the book?
I end up keeping the high majority of them, 90% at least. Part of the fun is finding ways to fold them in, I think.
Right. Okay. I guess these are not concepts or ideas that are coming from a void. Obviously you're thinking about the story and they are coming from a sort of an adjacency to the story. So there's a good chance that they will tie in regardless.
Absolutely. They're not completely random. They're thematically relevant, or they're relevant to the plot or setting or character to some degree. It's just, I don't know exactly what I'm doing with them. And this is, I think, what I was talking about when I was talking about trusting my subconscious a little bit. Like, they feel right. And that's the only way I can describe it, really. They feel right for the story at that moment, even if consciously I can't work out what it is that they're doing. But if I have faith in that instinct, then 95% of the time I'll work out why down the line. And it might mean that I need to move it around a little bit, or move exactly when it's introduced, or how it is that I use it. But most of the time, it's something that I can use to pay off something else later.
Okay, it sounds like you're very carte blanche with your redrafting. It sounds like you're willing to just totally like flip the whole novel on its head, not very precious with your kind of first draft.
So you say that, but I don't do significant amount of redrafting when I finish the final manuscript. What I do quite a lot of, and again, this some writers do, some writers don't, is I do quite a lot of editing as I go. So
right, okay.
I'll kind of write the first chapter and then really kind of edit it and play around with it and fix it and make sure it's going to get into shape before I move on to the second chapter. And I will continually do. I know some people sit down and write kind of a whole vomit draft and then go back and have to fix it all up. That really makes me uncomfortable because in my mind, if I'm thinking about the chronological reader experience of reading a book, each chapter is the foundation upon which the next chapter sits. And all the, character development, all of the emotions, the relationships, the plot points that happen in the previous chapters inform what you write in the next chapter. So in my mind, if the first chapter or the second chapter is a shaky foundation, if I have to go back and change things significantly there, I have to change the whole book. Because everything spills out from that. So I really spend probably more time than a lot of writers making sure as I go that everything that I write is in the tightest shape that I want it to be, which usually means actually by the end of the book, I don't have to do significant structural edits at all.
That's interesting. I feel like you're in quite a rare group of writers that are a discovery writer, but not a vomit draft writer. Most of the discovery writers I know, they just get it all out on the page and then they fix the whole thing in the redraft. And that, basically their vomit draft is just the plan.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, you're right. It's different to a lot of people's process. I've never really consciously thought about it other than it's just kind of what's worked for me. And then when talking to a lot of other writers, been like, oh, you guys don't write the way I write at all. But that's fine. Everybody's got their own way. I mean, there have been times. So the book that's coming out next year, and I'm not going to do the title because I don't think we've 100% agreed on it with my publisher. But the next novel, because I've got a novella coming out in September, the next novel that's coming out after Dissolution, that was an interesting experience because I did everything I just described. I sat down, I wrote it in the way that I normally write it, I edited it, I got to the end, and I was quite happy with it. But when I sent it off to my agent, I sent it off to a few kind of trusted writer friends to give it a kind of a beta read and give me some feedback on it, I had this really, again, quite instinctive sensation that it wasn't quite there. That it wasn't quite what I wanted it to be, and I couldn't put my finger on exactly why. I was too close to it. I couldn't work it out. I think I was looking at it with too much granularity, looking at the kind of the individual details in the chapters. But there was something that I just came out of it going, this isn't the best book that it could be. There's something fundamental missing, and I have no idea what it is. I got some feedback from different people, but nobody really quite touched on it. So I had to kind of stick it in a drawer for 6 months while I worked on some other stuff. And then when I came back to it, I had new ideas that were bubbling around at the back of my brain. I'd read more stuff in the interim. I'd thought about different things. It hit me like an absolute train when I was reading it again. I was like, oh, I completely see what I need to do. And basically I added an entirely new narrative arc. I added this whole frame narrative. I added an entirely new POV character. I ended up adding probably about 30,000 words on top of it.
Wow.
That completely changed the structure of the book. But for some reason, I just couldn't see it the first time around. And when I came back to it after 6 months, it was obvious that something was missing, and I knew what that missing piece was.
Yeah, I think it was, I might be wrong, but I think it was Zadie Smith who was saying the best thing you can possibly do for a novel is to write it and then leave it for years if you can, and then come back to it with fresh eyes. So it's definitely something that I think people acknowledge, is that if you can not think about something for a long time and detach from it, when you come back to it, you can really do a good job of fixing it up.
Yeah, if you have the luxury of doing that with
exactly.
You're on contract or whatever. But yeah, there is a definite value to that. And I'm a big believer in, especially if you've written a few books and you've kind of gone through that rodeo and you're quite practiced at it and you've read a lot, of trusting your authorial instincts and really listening to, even if you're not entirely sure why, if you think something isn't working, it's probably not working. And if you think something is, then hopefully it is. And so I'm a big believer in that. And hopefully it steers me in the right direction.
So far, so good, right?
Seemingly, yeah.
So you write and we touched on this just earlier with the new novel Dissolution. You write largely in the sort of speculative science fiction space, less so the magical realism. Even though when you're kind of going into someone's head, like we said, with an imagination, you can kind of it's not necessarily magic, but it's like you can get away with doing a lot of things in there. When you're working on a speculative concept, how important is the plausibility of it?
I think it has to feel plausible enough, or I think it has to feel plausible enough within the world with which it exists, and it has to feel, the reader has to buy that the characters feel that it's plausible, if that makes sense. Okay, which I think is a different thing from the readers thinking that it's a plausible thing that could happen in our world. You know, there's a certain suspension of disbelief that goes on when we read a book, which I think any reader of speculative fiction allows to some degree. But I am obviously working in a space where I'm kind of pretending it's the real world and then weird stuff is happening in it. And I think the balancing act is all about making sure that the characters that are experiencing these things are reacting to them in authentic ways, you know? Yeah. So if somebody shows up and suddenly says to you, hey, I've got a machine that can, dive into people's memories to me tomorrow in the real world, I'm unlikely to respond and just go, hey, cool, let's do that. I'm going to have more questions and I'm going to be a bit freaked out by it. Yeah. And so I think it's more about believable character authenticity than it is strictly about plausibility. And what I've found is that you can once you have that suspension of disbelief and once you have a reader on board buying, okay, we accept that some weird stuff is happening, we accept that there's an authentic sci-fi concept that the characters are bought into, that's when you can start to turn the screws a little bit, and that's when you can start to escalate. And if you are kind of deft enough with the pacing, you can actually take the book to a very, very, very weird place indeed that would be probably implausible at the beginning of the book, but the reader can follow you on the journey there if you do it kind of gradually, or not even necessarily gradually, but if you do it at the right pace, I think, essentially.
Yes, absolutely. It's about basically getting the reader, or if it's like a film or something, the viewer to buy in. Once they're bought in, you can get away with a lot more. You have a lot more leeway. Absolutely, yeah. And a good comparison, again, we go back to Inception. When you think about that as a concept objectively, it's kind of preposterous, the idea of we don't understand dreams really at all as humans, I don't think. Sure. So the idea that you could go into someone's dream with like some level of predictability and guarantee that you could influence them when they came out of the dream is wild, but it works because, like you say, and I think you hit the nail on the head with it there, is if the characters believe it and the characters are all taking it very seriously, you kind of buy in with the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that relies on having characters that you can empathize with and want to go on that journey with and feel emotionally connected with. Mm-hmm. But if that happens, you can kind of you can take a reader to some quite wild places as long as they're on board with the character, taking it seriously at the same time, for sure. Yeah.
That being said, there is a lot of the times people do put science fiction and fantasy side by side. That's why they're often referred to together as SFF. Is fantasy something that you'd ever be interested in writing?
It's a good question. The first novel I ever wrote actually was a proper Second World fantasy novel. Swords and magic and all of that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was terrible. But it was an interesting experience. I mean, I look back at my inspirations just in life generally, and what I read when I was younger and what I got passionate about. Things like Lord of the Rings really got me into fantasy when I was a kid, and I ended up reading a lot of fantasy around that time. But at the same time, my dad was kind of feeding me a steady diet of golden age science fiction. So like Asimov and Clarke, and then people like Philip K. Dick and things like that. So mm-hmm. I kind of had both at the same time. I probably lent more towards the SF as I got older. And then when I was an adult, I was reading just a wide range of things, thrillers, literary fiction, different types of speculative fiction, all sorts of things. I got very interested in kind of books that played experimentally with structure and things like that. But then when I finally decided to write a novel, when I must have been kind of mid-20s or something, I think there was just something comforting about the idea of writing in a fantasy world, because it really called back to like staying up late at night when I was like 11 years old and being lost in kind of some kind of fantasy trilogy. And so that's where I naturally gravitated, and I did that. And when I got to the end of it, and again, there was I was quite happy with myself. I thought it was quite good. It wasn't, but from the perspective of the time, I thought it was. And then I wrote another book after that. So I wrote a couple of books, and that was a fantasy book as well, but maybe a little bit more kind of weird with the structure and kind of some more sci-fi elements. And neither of them really went anywhere, partly because they weren't very good. And I had a moment where I kind of reflected and went, well, why is this not working for me? Is it because I'm not a good enough writer? Is it because I'm writing the wrong thing? And I really thought, well, what do I read now? What am I actually passionate about now? What am I really interested in? And at the time, I actually didn't read a huge amount of fantasy anymore. And I think I'd just gone to that comfortable place because it felt familiar. And what I needed to do was to push myself out of my comfort zone and write some things that I felt were maybe a little bit more exciting for me and a little bit more pushing the boundaries, which is what I started to do, which is when I wrote Professor Everywhere, which is my first novel, which is very kind of experimental, and it's got these kind of footnotes, and it's a kind of a fictional memoir told after a fictional event that's framed like it's happened in the real world, and all of these other kinds of things. And when I started doing that, I think that's when it really clicked, and I went, oh, this is the kind of stuff I want to be writing. I want to be able to break free of the boundaries of genre a little bit and really get weird with it and really play with structure and reader experience and time and all of these different things in a way that the strictures of a traditional fantasy genre and narrative just didn't allow me to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've had so many authors on who, when they talk about the sort of the first novel that they had written, or like maybe the first few novels they'd written, it took them a while to realize that they were not writing in the genre that they would really excel at. And it's often because a lot of the time authors don't write in the genre that they read in, and your first instinct is to write what you read, but that's not necessarily what's going to work for you as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not necessarily what excites you, and I think the process of writing and reading are two similar but fundamentally different processes. And some of the things that I absolutely love reading, I would not want to write and probably wouldn't really be able to write very well at all. Yeah. But I do think that the stuff that I write still sits within that wheelstuff of stuff that I enjoy to read as well. So I think one is broader than the other, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's about finding what works for you. Like with all these things, the whole process is about figuring out what works for you as an individual, because it won't be the same as anyone else who's writing. Yeah,
absolutely. Which is why I bounce off so much kind of didactic writing advice that you come across, whether that's in craft books or I've not really read many / any craft books properly, but you'd see it kind of spouted online and things like that of this is the way to write or have a process or whatever it happens to be. And I just think there is no way to write. The number of writers that I've spoken to over the course of my career thus far that all write in wildly different ways, I think is just wonderful, and it's just about finding your own process that works.
Yeah, absolutely. We're at the point in the episode where I ship you off and ask you, Nick, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book do you hope that it would be?
So I've been thinking about this question because I was slightly prepped for it, and I had lots of different thoughts going on in my mind of whether I wanted something comforting or whether I wanted something, that was big and long that I could kind of spend a long time with. I played around with the idea of House of Leaves by Danielewski because I think it's such a maximalist book. There's so much more to find in that book. But then decided that I'm not sure that the one book I wanted was horror on a desert island in the end. So I've decided that I'm going to cheat slightly. And and I'm going to pick the Earthsea Quartet, which is technically 4 books, but I have a published version of it all bound together as one book in my house. So I'm going to count I can take that, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, someone sent me a bound copy of all 3 Lord of the Rings books to prove that it could be bound. You can definitely bind the Earthsea books. They're much smaller.
Yeah. Cool, fantastic. All right, I'm binding the Earthsea books. Then I'll bind in the last one, The Other Wind, as well. Why not? It's quite short. So it's the Earthsea books I'm taking with me because I think they're just so special. They hold a very special place in my heart. I could reread them, and I have reread them again and again and again. And I think on a desert island, they would provide me with a bit of magic and escapism, but I also think that Le Guin's turn of phrase and expression and characters are constantly shifting under my fingertips, and I'm constantly finding something new that speaks to something deep in my soul. And I think it would be a wonderful thing and companion to have with me when I was stuck on my own.
Yes, I look at Ursula Le Guin just with awe when I think about her novels and things like that.
She was absolute goddess of writing.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And decades ahead of her time. Like, I read Left Hand of Darkness a few years ago for the first time, and I couldn't believe that this wasn't a novel that had come out like recently, because it's so topical.
Yeah, and I read, whether it's her fiction, again, fantasy, sci-fi, speculative fiction, which she does fantastically and topical and decades ahead of her time, or, you read essays that she wrote 30, 40 years ago, and I just think that's just so incisive and so keenly observed about humanity and society. She's just an amazing writer, an amazing woman.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the next half of this chat, I'd like to get into a bit more of Nick's writing journey, going back to when he first got his foot in the door of publishing. That discussion will all be available on patreon.com/rightandwrong.
Because that is how you get ideas. It is the act of writing that gives you ideas and that brings inspiration along. And so if you want to write something good, you need to just sit down and write.
Yeah. That's great advice, and it's a great quote and a great way to round off the episode. So thank you so much, Nick, for coming on the podcast and telling us all about your latest novel, Dissolution, which is going to be out right now as of this airing, and everything else that you've been up to. It's been really cool chatting with you. Thank you so much, Jamie. It's been lovely being on. Thanks for having me. And for anyone wanting to keep up with what Nick is doing, you can find him on Blue Sky at Binge Writing, or you can head over to his website, nicholasbinge.com. To support the podcast, like, follow and subscribe, join the Patreon for ad-free extended episodes, and check out my other podcast, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again to Nick, and thanks to everyone listening. We will catch you on the next episode.
Taxes was feeling so stuck. Sitting in traffic, squeezing into a parking spot, all to squeeze in getting tax help during your lunch break. Now Taxes is a TurboTax expert who does your taxes for you, while you go about your day getting real-time notifications about their progress and the most money back guaranteed. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile apps. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.